Hi, my name is Frank Schaefer, and I would like to explain something about J.D. Vance, the Trump administration, and their similarity to the extreme American left. Both the extreme American left on our university campuses and in some newsrooms, J.D. Vance and the Trump administration share something. They seem to hate Western civilization. J.D. Vance and Trump are siding with Russia, the enemy of the West, not just now, not just in the Cold War, but for 1,000 years. On our campuses, we have people protesting against Hamas and against Israel, but they come from an intellectual background on our elite campuses that has been dominated by professors in the humanities and history and women's studies and all the rest of it, who for a long time have been kind of either closet Marxists, actual Marxists, or post-Marxists, but nevertheless, people from the left who really don't like the West and don't like America. And anytime they talk about the West, they add that we are colonists or that we are racists or that we have stolen Native American lands, whatever. Now, it's strange that J.D. Vance signs with these people, but you have to understand he grew up in Appalachia and he went to an Ivy League university. But what part of Rome does he love? What experiences in Paris has he had that has made him a Francophile? What British literature has he read as a child, whether Beatrix Potter or something else, that set his mind on fire? What part of Chaucer's English does he find quaint and interesting? What part of the Norman conquest against the British people of the time does he find enlightening? What I'm talking about is the fact that I grew up in Europe as the son of American missionaries. But one of the things that marked my evangelical leader, Francis Schaeffer, was his interest in West as a culture and art and literature and music. He always talked about the failures and the sins of the West, from slavery to current racism. He ran a ministry in Switzerland that was many crazy things, but it was not racist. We had African students staying there in the 50s and 60s before it became fashionable. But the fact of the matter is, he inculcated in me a gratitude for the art, for the literature, for the culture, for the freedoms, for the democracy that came out of Western civilization alone. Yes, I just said that. From no other civilization. He saw a difference between, say, Saudi Arabia and the inheritance of Islam and Western culture, whether it's in the area of women's rights or how we treat gay people or whatever it may be. And he was an evangelical fundamentalist, pious Christian, and yet very dedicated to the West. You know, Winston Churchill at the end of Second World War told Roosevelt that they'd made a mistake at Yalta by allowing Stalin to carve up formerly Western countries like Germany and Poland and the so-called East Bloc. And he told Roosevelt that as far as he was concerned, the Allied forces, when they reached Berlin finally, should have kept marching until they reached Moscow, or at least held the nuclear weapon threat over Moscow's head and forced Stalin back out of Ukraine, out of Poland, out of the Eastern Bloc. Would have solved a lot of problems in terms of today's war of aggression and rape and killing of Ukraine by Putin. But now when you look at J.D. Vance and Donald Trump siding with Putin against Zelensky, siding with Russia against the West, siding with Saudi Arabia, where ironically they're holding peace talks in which Ukraine is not included, with a country that produced 19 of the 20 hijackers that committed the worst terrorist atrocity against the United States in American history. But because Bush was also an oil family and into the money, and the bin Ladens as an oil family and a real estate family in Saudi Arabia, he decided to punish Iraq for something clearly financed and engineered by Saudi mullahs on the extreme right, bin Laden, Saudi hijackers, Saudi money, contributions that we tracked all the way back to Saudi millionaires and billionaires and oil money that had funded bin Laden and al-Qaeda. But we punished Iraq and thereby foiled our victories that we could have had in Afghanistan, where, by the way, my Marine son, who volunteered before 9/11, and then was sent to war 3 times, twice in Afghanistan and one in Iraq, as a deployed U.S. Marine, was fighting. An odd circumstances for me because of my religious right background. I had fled. I happened to know people of the Bush family. I had a handwritten note from George Bush telling him that his mother told him to read the book that John and I wrote together called Keeping Faith, a Father-Son Story About Love in the United States Marine Corps. And his wife actually read a passage from an article I wrote for the Washington Post online on Meet the Press. That said, and the background I came from and fled, one thing we had in our evangelical background was a basic respect for Western values. It's why we supported Israel, aside from the idea of prophecy in Israel, fulfilling it by going back to the promised land, etc. It was the idea that Israel was a democracy set in a hostile Islamic world. And we saw that as a good thing. I'm not saying whether we were right or wrong, but that's how we saw it. So again, what a strange thing that the most anti-Western groups you find in America now are in the Trump administration and in the person of J.D. Vance, who in the call heard by the Atlantic editor that was included in a top secret security call by these clowns in the Trump administration, one thing he heard was J.D. Vance talking about the fact that it was a shame that we were attacking Houthi rebels who were attacking European shipping because the Europeans more or less had it coming. And 46% of their shipping and oil goes through the canal and only 3% of ours did. So what do we care? And here we are again bailing out these Europeans. Well, you know, that may be the attitude of a small town Appalachian boy who got out of Appalachia, wrote a book, et cetera, is now vice president. But it's not the view of people who love the West. You see, I value Thomas Jefferson, even though he was a slaveholder. I don't excuse his slaveholding, but I don't look at history through the template and the eyes and the judgment of the 21st century. No more that I read Shakespeare looking for his anti-Semitism or the fact that he was a misogynist in certain ways. I read Shakespeare as he wrote his plays. And I hope 100 years from now, if somebody reads a book like my memoir, Crazy for God, they do the same thing. They'll say, of course, Frank Schaeffer was limited to his period of history, but he did the best he could. I love Western culture because there are no good alternatives. Would you rather live in Iran? Would you rather live in Saudi Arabia? Would you rather live in bellicose, attacking, rapist Russia that has murdered its way across Ukraine? Do you think we have something to learn from Modi's Hindu nationalism? Would you rather live in China under the Communist Party? The West is it. You live here. Criticism of Western culture is perfectly licit. But to do what J.D. Vance has done and just write it off is exactly the same thing that those student demonstrators at Columbia did that have been accused of anti-Semitism in writing off the West and siding with Hamas. I'm sorry, that's what they did. So the elites in our universities, particularly in the humanities department, the women's studies departments, and all the rest of it, come from a Marxist background. They don't like the West. They're suspicious of it. They're blinkered against our values. They always have to say, yes, but we did this, we did that, we seized land, we did that. Okay, it's true, but that's the whole of Western history. Do you know who behaved very badly here in the United States? Native Americans who killed each other and enslaved each other. Do you know who behaved very badly in Africa? Africans before any colonists got there, who enslaved each other, massacred each other. I'm sorry, we're humans, we're violent, we're vicious, we're evil. The exception is when we're good. And one of those exceptions was the cry for Western values that came out of Reformation Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church in the 11th century that began to separate church and state, and that idea. Martin Luther saying, here I stand, I can do no other. Voltaire and the Enlightenment philosophers who pushed against Christianity because of its hypocrisy and fomented the French Revolution and the idea that the common man could rise up, the dignity of the individual, and overthrow the state, right or wrong, excessive or not. They had that idea. That is Western civilization. I value the West. I'm glad I live here. I wonder why J.D. Vance dislikes Europe when everything that comes to Americans in terms of our patriotism and our patrimony and our dedication to free speech and all these other things finds itself in the British common law, 1,000 years older than our own laws. Everything that we talk about in terms of human rights was torn out of the French Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Our values go back into the Italian Renaissance that, yes, was controlled by the Medici family who were out for a profit, exactly the kind of grifters that Donald Trump has become in our own country. But nevertheless, We have Caravaggio, we have Michelangelo, we have Leonardo da Vinci, we have Shakespeare. That's the West. I'm sorry they weren't all women. I'm sorry they weren't Black. I'm sorry they weren't Hispanic. That's our culture. How crazy that we've turned against Hispanic people coming in from our southern border when they come from our same Christian Western culture and share our values. How lucky we are that we don't have on our southern border Saudi Arabia or the Gulf states or Afghanistan. How lucky we are that the people pressing across our border, because they are either Roman Catholics or Pentecostal Christians, often share our values. Yes, values matter. Who else is for the West out there and will defend it? Our White House is turned against the West. Our vice president glories in the fact that only 3% of our trade comes through the canal, and the Europeans are stuck. Oh, why are we bailing them out again? As if somehow this is not our culture. Excuse me, my last name is Schaefer. That's a German name. People I know have Dutch last names and French last names and Scandinavian last names. This is where we are from. Only fools forget their history. Only fools turn their backs on their friends. And yes, Europe is often decadent and dependent on us and has gotten a free ride. And Donald Trump has asked some good questions, by the way. I think he's coming up with some of the wrong answers. And one of those wrong answers is hiring J.D. Vance, who apparently hates Europe, as his vice president. Where the fuck do Tucker Carlson and his buddy J.D. Vance and these other idiots like Elon Musk get off distancing us from Western Europe, distancing us from our inheritance, distancing us from the fruits of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and the Reformation and Christianity that gave us freedoms and women's rights that no other culture has produced? Where do these idiots on left-wing campuses get off training a whole generation of students to hate our own culture because it wasn't perfect, to judge it by the standards of the 21st century? Who stands for the West? My name is Frank Schaefer.